Good morning. Good to see you. Hope you're well today. Today I'm going way back in the Old Testament to pick up a story, a detail in a story about Joseph. Now you may remember the story of Joseph if you haven't read it recently. A brief outline: Joseph was the 11th son of Jacob, who was renamed Israel, and he was the favourite son. His father favoured him because he was the first son of his favourite wife, and gave him a coat of many colours, and he had dreams of greatness and grandeur, and his brothers hated him and were jealous of him. And when an opportunity arose, they were going to kill him, but by chance this caravan of camels and traders came past, and they sold him as a slave to them, and they took him to Egypt, and he was sold to Potiphar, and he served in the house of Potiphar. Then he was accused of trying to rape his very promiscuous master's wife, and he was sent into prison, and he was in prison for quite a while, and there he met two of the servants of Pharaoh who were in prison, who also had dreams which he interpreted, and when the dreams came true, they forgot about him, and he stayed in prison for quite a long time. All the time that he was serving other people, he served them to the best of his ability, but he suffered a great deal as a slave. And then Pharaoh had a dream about cows and ears of corn, very, very thin ears of corn that swallowed up 7 very fat ones, and there were 7 of the lean ones, and seven thin cows that ate up the 7 big, healthy, well-fed cows, 7 of each. And they remember before Pharaoh, the cupbearer remembers Joseph and recommends him to Pharaoh as an interpreter of dreams, and he interprets the dream of Pharaoh to mean that there would be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine, and that the Egyptians should store up grain and provisions against the 7 years of famine that were coming. And he gets appointed by Pharaoh as the one to coordinate all of that, and he does that. And his family back home become very hungry and in need, and his brothers, apart from his younger brother, the second child of his father's favourite wife who had died, he stays at home. The other brothers come down into Egypt, and they don't recognise Joseph, but he recognises them. And eventually everything gets sorted out. They're reconciled. They realise who Joseph is, and the whole family come and settle in Egypt. Well, that summarises about 20 chapters of Genesis. Quick whip round the life of Joseph. But here is Joseph, still ruling in Egypt. His family are there, and his father, his very elderly father, eventually dies. And then that takes us to Genesis 50, verse 15. Let me read you what happens here. Excuse me. Now when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil which we did to him." Now, in the natural, you would think that could possibly happen, that while the father was alive, Joseph would keep within himself the anger and the resentment and the hatred and the revenge planning that he might have done through all those years of hardship that were caused by his brother's evil deeds towards him. In fact, they kept up a pretense with the father until they went to Egypt and then confessed it to their father. He thought Joseph had been torn apart by wild animals, and they'd let their father mourn for him for years. They weren't nice men, his brothers. They were schemers. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, forgive, I pray you, the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now we pray you, forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. I'm not surprised. Joseph's heart was quite different to theirs. He had no resentment against them. He had no anger. He had no built-up bitterness. He hadn't in his heart planned vengeance on them at all. And he was so hurt by what they said that they actually thought the only way that to persuade him to be kind to them was to scheme again that their father had left him a message. Their father knew him better than they did. There was no message. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, Behold, we are your servants. But Joseph said to them, Fear not, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. He could see that God's plan had been in it all along, that without someone in Egypt to manage the famine and keep enough produce there, without someone knowing the interpretation to those dreams, many, many people would have died of famine during those very lean 7 years. And God had a purpose behind everything that happened to Joseph, and Joseph knew it. He knew that he was in God's place, that God had his hand on him. He knew God was with him throughout all those difficulties and troubles. And he was shocked that his brothers thought that he had been harbouring evil thoughts against them. He never had. And this is such a lesson for us. It upholds in a wonderful picture way the verse that is in Romans 8:28, which says, We know that in everything God works for good with those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. Or we know that in everything God works for good for those who love him. That was what Joseph knew. He knew that God was working through the circumstances for his good. What the enemy meant for evil, God turned it into good. And this is a lesson we can learn. This is what the scriptures teach us. That even when we are going through really difficult circumstances, perhaps as a result of things other people have done to us, we can know with absolute certainty that God is working it all out for our good. He's working in the back. What the enemy meant for evil, God meant it for Joseph's good. And so he does for us. So whatever difficult situation you are in, stop and see. Consider the life of Joseph. If you haven't read the life of Joseph recently, read it and see the awful things that happened to him as a direct result of what his brothers did to him. And see how he remained faithful to God throughout all the difficulties. He didn't rail at God. Some people would rail at God and say, how could you let this happen to me? How could you do this to me? Why did you let my brothers treat me like that? Or he could have blamed himself. He could have said, it's my own fault. I told them my dreams. I told them they would bow down to me. And it upset them. And it's my fault. He could have blamed himself. Instead, he simply served God and waited for God's timing to be perfect. There's a real lesson in all of this for us. God works for good in everything that happens to us because we're called according to his purpose. Have a great Sunday. God bless you. Bye-bye.